Good day, everyone, my fellow paper presenters, participants, and most especially the organizers of this academic event. I am Dr. Galahad Randall Unciano of the Gichuary Research Consultancy in Social Sciences, located in Urdaneta City, Pangasinan, Philippines. Today, I present to you my study entitled The Politics of Anti-Corruption, Rhetorical Strategies and Messaging by Philippine Legislators with Gender-Comparative Analysis. I designed this study to be interdisciplinary with its research phenomena, methods, and theoretical framework presupposing the intersection of political science, communication studies, and applied linguistics. These also reflect my versatile academic background and topics of personal interest. Starting off with the rationale behind this research endeavor, in response to the 2025 flood control corruption scandals, members of both the Senate and the House of Representatives in the Philippines have publicly expressed strong condemnation, launched investigations, and demanded accountability for those involved. I was motivated by this systemic corruption exposed and the need to understand how political language shapes public understanding and accountability. So my study actually examined the theoretical strategies and messaging used by Philippine legislators in response to these corruption scandals. I conducted this recent study, which was completed last October of this year, as I believe it poses significance to the ongoing concerns of our country. This study clarifies how political messaging, especially among our legislators, might be used to downplay or distract from the issue of corruption. It attempts to analyze if the way our government is communicating about the scandal is genuinely contributing to problem solving or if it is hindering its progress. It is my hope that this simple study can help the public to become more discerning about the political messages that are posted on media every day that challenge every Filipino citizen to critically evaluate whether our politicians are genuinely addressing the corruption issues or merely using specific rhetoric for their political gain. On this day, November 30th, as I present this study, a massive crowd of Filipinos, estimated to reach hundreds of thousands, are on their way to occupy EDSA for the Trillion Peso March. This is still part of the ongoing large-scale series of anti-corruption protests in our country, organized by a broad coalition of civil society, Filipino youth, religious, and labor groups. These protests continue to demand accountability and transparency in the Philippine government regarding massive corruption in infrastructure projects. The environmental group Greenpeace estimated that as much as 1.9 trillion pesos intended for climate-related and flood control projects have been lost to corruption. In spirit, I march along with our fellow Filipinos in EDSA today, even in this modest academic gesture of presenting my study for this event. This current slide shows the general problem of my research. My study analyzed the rhetoric in the political messages of Philippine legislators in response to the ongoing flood control corruption scandals. My corpus of analysis included samples of political messaging from our local legislators, which were extracted from news archives and social media posts. Descriptive and inferential comparative analysis were performed to explore the nuances in rhetorical strategies across legislators who were grouped according to type and sex. My study also tested the potential link between legislators' choice of rhetoric strategies and the rhetoric types that shape their political messages. My investigations revolved around six research questions. My study addressed a total of four descriptive research questions and two inferential research questions. The inferential questions generated a total of four null hypotheses that were tested statistically. Integral to the objective of my study is the production of a research output. After completing this study, I developed the descriptive rhetorical model of legislative anti-corruption messaging, abbreviated as DRM-LAM, localized in the Philippine setting. This descriptive model is intended to show patterns and regularities that characterize the political language of Philippine legislators, focusing on their use of rhetoric styles. This model also clarifies how Philippine lawmakers navigate the complex ethical and political dilemmas they face when addressing corruption. This document is separately archived in my accounts in ResearchGate and Academia, which are publicly accessible. For my research methodology, my study's investigative procedure operated within an exploratory sequential mixed methods research design. Given this type of research design, two contiguous phases were involved: a qualitative phase followed by a quantitative phase. The initial qualitative phase of my study involved the use of rhetorical analysis to identify the specific rhetorical strategies and types inherent in the political messages. After completing this phase, the investigations transitioned to a quantitative phase that involved descriptive analysis to identify frequency patterns and prevalence of rhetorical strategies and types manifested in the political messages of the legislators, and the further inferential analysis using chi-square test of independence to test the study's null hypothesis. I used manual data analysis or MDA in my conduct of rhetoric analysis instead of availing computer-assisted qualitative data analysis softwares, so that my effort to go through all the texts in my corpus is really labor intensive. In this manual analysis, I utilize two analytical frameworks that are shown in this slide as a guide for me to categorize the rhetorical strategies and rhetorical types inherent in the political messages. The unit of analysis in my study is called a rhetorical artifact, or RA. In the context of my study, these artifacts are actually segments of political messages on the subject of anti-corruption authored by Philippine legislators. The aggregate of all the texts that I analyzed comprise the corpus of my study. In determining this corpus, I used purposive sampling aided by intelligent sampling. Purposive sampling was used because I needed first to identify who among the Philippine legislators from the two chambers have prominently and consistently spoken about anti-corruption in the context of the ongoing political discourse on the flood control corruption scandals. This is where intelligent sampling comes handy, because AI can literally nominate who these legislators are based on the density of their contributions of anti-corruption messages. AI can perform an automated search through massive databases like news archives, social media, or public records. AI also performed the automated search of all the texts containing the relevant political messages from these legislators that I needed for my study. After securing all these resources, I then manually performed the rhetorical analysis of the texts. The sampling procedure that I explained a while ago led to the identification of 13 senators and 9 members of the House of Representatives, and a total of 194 texts that contain the relevant anti-corruption messages. From the individual texts, I extracted the segments that bear the political messages. Out of the 194 texts, I extracted a total of 483 samples of political messages. They were numerous enough to enable me to subject these units for inferential analysis. The table in this slide illustrates the number of texts analyzed. The presentation deliberately de-emphasizes the identity of the authors. This was done for the sake of research ethics. The identity of the legislators were deliberately concealed, as well as those actual texts attributed to them that contain their political messages in order to prevent the possibility of their re-identification. Since there is not enough time to thoroughly discuss the details of my research findings, I will only show the sets of tabulated data that were used in discussing the results of my analysis corresponding to each of the research questions. After completing my research investigations, I arrived at the following conclusions. There is a pattern of limited legislative engagement with the current corruption issues in the Philippines. The small number of senators and extremely low percentage of the members of the House of Representatives publicly addressing corruption suggest a widespread legislative silence. This low rate of engagement can foster a public perception of complicity among legislators that undermine confidence in government institutions. Majority of individual senators as well as members of the House of Representatives primarily used an invitational rhetorical strategy. Senators who employ intrusive rhetoric tend to do so more frequently than their counterparts. Populist rhetoric was the most common type used by senators, which may indicate how senators view it as the more effective or politically beneficial approach for simplifying complex corruption issues. Institutional rhetoric was the second most common, indicating that some senators prefer to frame issues within a legal and governmental context. Rhetoric of inaction was the most common type for members of the House of Representatives. This suggests their prevalent tendency to frame their actions as constrained by external factors to deflect responsibility. Populist rhetoric was also highly common among them, but institutional rhetoric was not a prevalent strategy for any of them, suggesting that members of the House of Representatives are less likely to rely on formal institutional language compared to the senators. There is a statistically significant difference in the use of rhetorical strategies between male and female legislators across types of legislators. Male legislators were more likely to use invitational rhetoric, while female legislators were more likely to use intrusive rhetoric. This contradicts traditional gender stereotypes about communication styles, as these findings suggest that female politicians may adopt a more assertive approach to establish authority and navigate a rather male-dominated political environment. There is also a statistically significant difference in the use of rhetoric types between the sexes. Only male legislators used institutional rhetoric and rhetoric of denial or justification, while female legislators primarily used popular rhetoric and rhetoric of inaction. The use of invitational strategy was most likely to shape legislators' anti-corruption messaging to assume a populist rhetoric impression, while intrusive strategies were most likely to shape their political messaging to assume a rhetoric of inaction impression. These imply that intrusive rhetoric is more likely to be associated with negative outcomes, such as having political messages that communicate denial, justification, and inaction, which could damage public trust over these legislators. From the insights gained in my research findings, I offered recommendations that I signified to the interest of Philippine legislators. My study implies that it is more advantageous for politicians to be seen as taking a stand on issues, especially when it comes to corruption. My recommendations also signify to the interest of the Filipino citizens. The interest of science education and curriculum. The interest of language and communication arts education and curriculum. As for future research, I recognize the limitation of my study's analysis to explain how politicians tailor their political messaging in relation to certain variables because I had a limited set of variables. Future research then can explore the interplay of other factors like political affiliations, relationships with constituents, and the nature of corruption or any political issue at hand as to how these can possibly influence the choice of rhetorical strategies. In closing my presentation, I present this slide for my acknowledgement on the impetus and inspiration behind my conceptualization and conduct of this study. To the good legislators of this country, whose political messaging on anti-corruption became the inspiration for this study, this modest work is humbly offered. In spirit, I join the countless Filipinos bravely advocating for justice and equitable governance, particularly those who march on the streets and utilized online platforms to demand government accountability regarding the grand flood control corruptions. In your honor, this study is respectfully dedicated. This public dissemination of the study was supported by extramural funding from generous friends, sponsors, and supporters of the noble causes of the Gichuary Research Consultancy in Social Sciences. My special thanks to the sponsorship of Mrs. Cecilia Grospe Manipon of Bantog, Asingan, Pangasinan. Thank you very much for listening.